On any given morning in Washington, D.C., kids board buses, walk to school, or wait for their parents to drop them off. It's routine, noisy, chaotic, and predictable. But in March of 2014, an 8-year-old girl quietly vanished from that routine. And for weeks, no one even noticed she was missing. Her name was Relisha Rudd, and her disappearance is one of the most haunting examples of a child slipping through the cracks of a system that was supposed to protect her. The story that followed was tangled in failed oversight, broken trust, and a trail of missed warnings. And at the center of it all was a man who should have never been anywhere near her. Relisha lived in the D.C. General Homeless Shelter, a facility that had once been a hospital but was now being used as emergency housing. It was overcrowded and under-resourced, filled with hundreds of families who had nowhere else to go. Her mother, 𝘱𝘰𝘮𝘭𝘪𝘴, had struggled with poverty and instability for years, and by the time Relisha was 7, she had spent much of her childhood moving between shelters, relatives' homes, and temporary housing. Despite these challenges, Relisha was known to be a bright, sweet, and quiet child. Teachers at Payne Elementary School said she was shy but attentive. She didn't cause trouble, didn't draw attention. She was the kind of kid that could easily fade into the background, and maybe that's what happened. Because when Relisha stopped coming to school in early March 2014, no one raised an alarm right away. Her mother had told the school that Relisha was under the care of a doctor. His name, she said, was Dr. Tatum. He was helping Relisha with health issues. That was the explanation that kept being given when Relisha missed school for days, then weeks. But there was no Dr. Tatum. The man she was referring to was 𝘗𝘠𝘪𝘴, a 51-year-old janitor at the homeless shelter. He wasn't a doctor. He had no medical background. He was just a maintenance worker who had been around the shelter for years. Somehow, he had become close with Relisha's family, close enough to take her places, buy her gifts, and earn the trust of her mother. How this relationship developed, and why it was allowed to continue, remains one of the most disturbing aspects of the case. According to reports, Tatum would bring Relisha gifts, toys, a tablet, even money. He had also been known to take her off-site. At one point, he took her to a pool party. Another time, to a hotel. All of this, incredibly, with the knowledge of her family. Some have speculated that the relationship was seen as a kind of mentorship or father-figure connection. Others believe something far more sinister was at play. What's clear is this: Tatum had access to Relisha. He had control. And by the time authorities realized who he really was, it was already too late. On March 19, 2014, a social worker from Payne Elementary finally decided something wasn't right. They reached out to 𝘷𝘀C's Child and Family Services Agency. They wanted to speak directly to this so-called doctor. What they found instead triggered an immediate emergency alert. There was no doctor. 𝘗𝘠𝘪𝘴 wasn't licensed in any capacity. And more alarmingly, no one had seen Relisha in days, not at school, not at the shelter, not with her family. The very next day, an Amber Alert was issued for Relisha Rudd. Police began investigating Tatum, and what they uncovered was chilling. He had a criminal record. He had served time for burglary, larceny, and breaking and entering. He was not someone who should have been near vulnerable families, let alone children living in a shelter. But somehow, he had passed background checks and had held his job for years. Authorities immediately tried to locate both Tatum and Relisha. Surveillance footage from March 1 showed the two together, walking down a hotel hallway at a Holiday Inn in Northeast D.C. That was the last known sighting of her. After that, Tatum's movements became erratic. He was spotted buying large trash bags. He checked into multiple hotels. And on March 20th, just one day after the Amber Alert was issued, his wife, Andrea Tatum, was found shot to death in a Maryland motel. Police believe 𝘗𝘠𝘪𝘴 killed her. Now the urgency exploded. This wasn't just a missing child. This was potentially a child in the hands of a man who had just murdered someone close to him. And the worst part? Tatum had a full 18 days head start. While the school had accepted the doctor's note explanation, while no one was checking on Relisha, this man had time to run, hide, and possibly cover his tracks. Search teams mobilized. They combed through hotels, homeless camps, and parks. The FBI joined in. So did community organizations. People printed flyers, searched wooded areas, and prayed for a miracle. But Relisha Rudd was nowhere to be found. What haunted investigators the most was the silence. There was no ransom call, no text messages, no photos. Tatum had simply disappeared. Some believed he may have fled the area. Others feared the worst, that he had harmed Relisha and hidden her remains. Then, on March 31st, just 12 days after the Amber Alert was issued, the story took a devastating turn. Khalil Tatum was found dead from a self-inflicted gunshot wound in a park in northeast D.C. Beside him was a gun. No note. No sign of Relisha. He had taken his secrets with him. In the final moments of this episode, we're left staring at the image of a girl whose disappearance didn't happen in the shadows, it happened in broad daylight. A child, surrounded by adults, officials, and a system meant to protect her. A girl who was failed, not just by one person, but by many. And the one man who could have told us what happened? He ended his life before anyone could ask. In the next episode, we'll trace the last known movements of Khalil Tatum, and we will examine what the hotel footage revealed, and the chilling timeline that investigators pieced together in the days before he was found. Because some believe the clues to Relisha's fate were hiding in plain sight, and they may still be there. When the Amber Alert finally went out for Relisha Rudd on March 20, 2014, it was already too late. The window to save her, if there had ever been one, had closed. Authorities were not chasing a kidnapping in progress. They were unraveling a crime that had likely begun weeks earlier. The focus immediately turned to the man who had last been seen with her, Khalil Tatum. And the deeper they looked, the clearer it became, he had not just vanished with her. He had been planning something long before anyone noticed she was missing. After Relisha was last spotted on March 1st, walking with Tatum inside a DC hotel, everything about his behavior changed. That night, the two were seen in surveillance footage entering the Holiday Inn Express. She was walking calmly beside him, carrying a plastic bag. He followed behind. There was no obvious sign of fear. No one raised an alarm. They checked in, and the door closed behind them. That was the last confirmed sighting of Relisha Rudd. What happened inside that hotel room has never been confirmed. In the days that followed, Tatum did not flee, not right away. He stayed local, moved from one hotel to another, and made a series of purchases that later unsettled investigators. On March 2nd, he was seen at a Home Depot buying industrial-strength trash bags, lime, and a shovel. Police would later describe this trip as deeply suspicious, but at the time, no one was watching him. He kept up appearances. He returned to work briefly at the DC General Shelter. He even continued speaking to people inside Relisha's family circle. No one questioned him, not yet. But whatever he was planning, it was not spontaneous. By March 18th, Tatum had moved again. This time to the Red Roof Inn in Oxon Hill, Maryland. But he was not alone. He had convinced his wife, Andrea Tatum, to meet him there. We still don't know exactly what was said between them, or whether she knew anything about Relisha. What we do know is that within hours of arriving, Andrea was dead. She had been shot in the head, execution style. No signs of a struggle. Nothing missing from the room. By the time police traced Tatum to the hotel, he was gone. Now the case had escalated from missing person to double investigation, a child missing, and a murder on record. The FBI launched a multi-agency manhunt. Helicopters swept wooded areas, law enforcement poured through surveillance footage, and hundreds of tips poured in. But Tatum had a head start. At this point, no one even knew if Relisha was still alive. Cell phone records placed him in several areas around the DC and Maryland border, especially around Kenilworth Park and Aquatic Gardens, a sprawling green space with over 700 acres of marsh, trails, and hidden pockets. Search dogs were brought in. Volunteers walked shoulder to shoulder through brush and riverbanks. Dozens of law enforcement officers combed through the terrain. But nothing turned up. Until March 31st. In a wooded area of Kenilworth Park, investigators discovered a body beneath a makeshift shelter made of plywood and debris. It was Khalil Tatum. He had died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. Beside his body was a gun. No blood spatter beyond the immediate area. No signs of another person nearby. He had chosen this place deliberately, far enough into the park to delay discovery, close enough to remain hidden. There was no suicide note. No mention of Relisha, and no explanation, just silence. What came next was agonizing. Investigators scoured the area around his body, hoping that he had left behind a clue, something that might lead them to Relisha. But there was nothing. Not a footprint, not a piece of clothing, not even one of the toys he had once given her. If Tatum had taken her life, he had done it elsewhere. If she was still alive, there was no trail. But there were theories. And one in particular grew louder, that Khalil Tatum's actions were not random or isolated. That this was not a simple case of a man losing control. Some believed he had help. There were unanswered questions about how a man with a criminal record got a job at a homeless shelter, and how he was allowed to develop relationships with vulnerable families without oversight. Questions about why the shelter did not report concerns sooner. And most of all, why Relisha's school accepted excuses from her mother for nearly 3 weeks before notifying social services. A breakdown had happened at every level. When the FBI looked deeper into Tatum's background, they discovered something else. He had connections to known traffickers in the region. While nothing was ever confirmed, it opened a terrifying possibility that Relisha had not been killed. She had been sold, or handed off, as part of a larger operation. If that was the case, Tatum's suicide did not bring closure. It ended the only clear lead. In a moment, everything changed. The one man who might have known where Relisha was, or what he had done, was dead. And all that remained was the silence he left behind. No body. No note. No answers. Just a small child, missing in plain sight, and a community struggling to understand how this happened. In the next episode, the final in this case, we examine the foster care and shelter systems that failed to protect Relisha. We look at the dark theories that still swirl around her disappearance. And we return to the one place where some say her spirit still lingers. Because if Relisha Rudd is gone, then where is she? And if she is alive, why hasn't anyone seen her? After more than a decade, the disappearance of 8-year-old Relisha Rudd still feels like a wound that never closed. It wasn't just that she vanished. It was how. Quietly. Gradually. Almost without anyone noticing. And what followed was more than just a failed search. It was a collapse of the systems built to protect her, the adults around her, and the truth. This final episode is not a resolution. It's a reckoning. The last confirmed sighting of Relisha was on March 1, 2014. That's when she appeared on hotel surveillance footage with Khalil Tatum. She was carrying a bag. He was calm. They looked like they were simply checking in. But she never came out. And by the time the alarm was raised 3 weeks later, everything that might have helped locate her, the cameras, the records, even the man she was with, was gone. And still, one question echoes louder than the rest. How does a child go missing for 3 weeks, and no one notice? The more investigators looked, the more troubling the picture became. The D.C. General Shelter where Relisha lived had no protocol in place to track the daily whereabouts of children. It had no system for logging who took kids off-site. Volunteers and employees came and went with minimal vetting. When asked why no one raised concerns about Relisha being gone so long, some shelter staff admitted they hadn't even noticed. Others thought she was just staying with relatives. No one thought to check. But perhaps the most heartbreaking oversight came from her school. Payne Elementary received excuse notes claiming Relisha was sick, under the care of Dr. Tatum. These notes came from her mother, Shamika Young. And for weeks, they were accepted without question. But there was no doctor. Tatum was a janitor. And yet, no red flags were raised. Not when Relisha missed over 10 consecutive days. Not when her absences stretched into 3 full weeks. It wasn't until a school social worker grew suspicious and contacted child services that the truth began to unravel. By then, it was far too late. So what happened to Relisha? There are theories. Many of them. The most widely accepted theory is that she was murdered by Khalil Tatum, likely in the days following the hotel check-in. Investigators believe his purchase of lime, trash bags, and a shovel points to a deliberate attempt to dispose of a body. Yet despite extensive searches, in hotels, parks, rivers, and even landfills, her remains have never been found. That's what keeps the second theory alive. Some believe Relisha may have been trafficked. Tatum had a criminal background and loose connections to known trafficking operations. He had access to vulnerable families, trust within the shelter, and the ability to move people without scrutiny. It's possible, some argue, that he handed Relisha off to someone else, someone who helped him disappear her. And if that's true, then her trail didn't end in a DC park. It's still out there. There's a third theory, rarely spoken aloud, but impossible to ignore. Some wonder if people within Relisha's own family knew more than they admitted. Questions have long surrounded the role of her mother, about why she let her daughter spend so much time with a grown man, why she lied to the school, and why it took so long to raise concern. There was no evidence to charge her with wrongdoing, but the inconsistencies in her story have fueled public suspicion for years. And the silence remains. In the years since Relisha vanished, there have been no credible sightings. No new leads. But her name hasn't been forgotten. Every March, around the anniversary of her disappearance, her image returns to the headlines. Vigils are held. Missing person flyers are reshared. Activists push for reform in child welfare systems, tighter protocols, better oversight, mandatory school response timelines. Her face has become a symbol of failure, and a call to never let it happen again. But there's another layer to this story. One that doesn't get talked about as often. Some say Relisha's presence still lingers in the very place she once called home. The now abandoned DC General Shelter, shuttered in 2018 due to its unsafe conditions, is said to be filled with echoes. Doors that slam without reason. A child's voice heard in the dark. Volunteers and security guards once claimed they felt watched in the hallways. No proof. No photos. Just rumors. But in a case like this, the lines between mystery and memory often blur. More than 10 years have passed since Relisha Rudd was last seen. If she were alive today, she'd be 18, an adult, finally old enough to speak for herself. But she hasn't spoken. Not once. Not anywhere. So we're left with what we know. A girl vanished from a city filled with people. A man took her, killed his wife, then killed himself. And a decade later, no one can say for sure where she went, or why. The system lost Relisha Rudd. Now, the question is, can it lose another?